All right, let's go. Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion. This is week 6, the horror of being at home at work. Last session we discussed Poe's The Black Cat and the importance of showing the horrors that exist within the home or the domestic space. Poe's use of the uncanny Gothic at a surface level created a space for readers to appreciate the far more subtle gestures to the domestic evils that all too often become expressed as a series of mere household events. The heavily racialized language indicates Poe's sensitivity to a slave-owning South and the ability for those who believe in the rationalizing implications of causal logic to overlook the horrors that existed in their everyday lives. Modern readers, of course, should still feel the sting of his logic as they read, because those racialized horrors haven't gone away, nor have the domestic ones. They're still all too with us. Today, we investigate a story that has not traditionally been read as Gothic in nature. It lacks most of the characteristics that I set forth in the first week of class. There's no terror, there's no torture, there's no house, there's no ghosts, there's no ghouls. On occasion, Melville will employ the technique that we saw with Irving. He'll drench his narrator's description of the innocuous office worker with Gothic prose, but the whole of the story is tinged with a melancholy curiosity rather than a sense of terror. Does that ring true? To connect the story to the Gothic, then, I'll explore the question, how does the Gothic express itself in what are seemingly inhospitable spaces to the Gothic, and what does that mean for the reader? So here we go. I divided today's lecture into 4 different points. So the first point is going to discuss the eradication of the human. So, the story of Bartleby is a sad one. A lonely worker ends up dying alone. Not much information is provided about Bartleby beyond the observations of a narrator whose affable manner and curiosity about his scrivener make most readers kindly disposed toward his words. Almost, not quite, but almost as much as Crayon. I mean, would you agree? He seems like a really nice guy. Pleasant, affable, well-spoken. Melville, though, I think, encourages readers to understand the narrator's concern about the humanity of Bartleby, as can be seen in his ending statement, Bartleby, humanity, with suspicion. And that's what I want to explore today. So what the narrator fails to reflect on is his participation in a power structure that ends up dehumanizing his employees, making them functional objects rather than human persons worthy of respect. This can be seen in 2 ways. First, there's the arrangement of the office space. Upon hiring Bartleby as his 4th employee, the narrator redesigns his office space. So before Bartleby was hired, the room was divided into 2 parts by ground glass folding doors that the narrator could open or shut depending on his humor. If he wanted to see people, he'd open them. If he didn't want to see anybody, he would close them, but he was the one in control of the doors. The new scrivener would be placed in a corner on the narrator's side of the folding doors with an easy call in case any trifling thing was to be done. The desk was, quote, close up to a small side window in that part of the room, a window which, owing to subsequent erections, commanded at present no view at all, although it gave some light because within 3 feet of the panes was a wall, and the light came down from far above between 2 lofty buildings. And there's that Kafkaesque touch, right? I mean, there's no view anywhere. Things are dimly lit. Light comes from far above where it's inaccessible, things like that. But the finishing touch, I think, is the most important, and it's where he introduces a new wall into the interior. Quote, still further to a satisfactory arrangement, I procured a high green folding screen, which might entirely isolate Bartleby from my sight, though not remove him from my voice. And thus, in a manner, privacy and society were conjoined. End quote. Modern readers recognize the desks surrounded by walls that screen vision but allow for sound within a room whose access to natural light is limited as a cubicle. We're familiar with cubicles? How many of you have seen or spent time at a cubicle at some point? Right, I mean, that's what they are. They're screened off. You can't see, but you can still hear when people are shouting commands at you. This organizational scheme is calculated to maximize efficiency. The narrator writes, quote, one object I had in placing Bartleby so handy to me behind the screen was to avail myself of his services on such trivial occasions. End quote. Summoning the handy unseen helpers that surround him, the narrator engineers an office space haunted by interchangeable anonymous clerks. This arrangement puts the narrator at the center of a hierarchy of power where he's kept invisible while allowing his commandments to be heard. The workers, subjected to observation at the narrator's whim, become functions rather than people. Does that make sense? The second reference to dehumanization becomes clear with his depiction of the workers themselves: Turkey, Nippers, and Ginger Nut. I really just love the names. Turkey and Nippers clearly function as an interchangeable unit, each fit for a half day of work, while Ginger Nut is not quite up to their level of expertise. The bizarre nature of the names, dealing with food and beverages, offers insight into the nature of this particular workplace. While the narrator remains unnamed throughout, the nicknames foisted upon the workers are disconnected from any sense of longevity or history. They become quickly depersonalized in spite of their peculiarities. The level of control assumed by the narrator betrays itself in his writing about them. Quote, "Their fits relieved each other like guards. When Nippers was on, Turkey's was off, and vice versa. This was a good natural arrangement under the circumstances." End quote. The fact that the narrator believes that guard-like rotations are a natural arrangement, not to mention something that's good, supplies the reader with a sense of how the narrator treats his workers like machines. And that's one of the things he loves about Bartleby initially, right, is his machine-like capacity to just copy. He's a Xerox. He's a human Xerox machine at the very beginning. But how this machine-like sense of efficiency is something that can already be viewed as natural rather than imposed is somewhat scary, considering that it was written in the mid-19th century, right? I mean, that's already there, that sense that the best workers are the ones that are most mechanically oriented and arranged. Further, the lawyer's initial impulse in selecting Bartleby as an employee was that his singularly sedate temperament might operate beneficially on the excesses of Turkey and Nippers, evening them out so as to make all equal, indistinguishable, and functional. As the story continues, Ginger Nut, who is initially distinguished from the others due to his young age, becomes increasingly assimilated with the other men. They're not individuals. They lack that individuating sense of their own humanity and their own personhood. Bartleby, of course, takes the notion of dehumanization to its ultimate conclusion. By preferring not to leave the workplace, Bartleby is uniquely able to show the consequences of living at work. One way that Melville discloses this is in depicting the range of Bartleby's possessions. The lawyer eventually realizes that, quote, "For an indefinite period, Bartleby must have ate, dressed, and slept in my office, and that too without plate, mirror, or bed." He locates Bartleby's possessions: a blanket, a blacking box and brush, a tin basin with soap and a rag towel, a few crumbs of ginger nuts, and a morsel of cheese, end quote. The lawyer is horrified at this, but his horror stems not from Bartleby's poverty, evidenced in his choice of lodging in his few possessions, but from the loneliness of the situation. The personal belongings are solely engineered to sustain life, that's the food and the blanket, and to maintain appearances, that's the soap, the towel, and the blacking box. Even the narrator is able to recognize this as testifying to a lonely condition. Bartleby's things reflect someone who has appropriated an abstracted existence, a man without particularities, someone without the history of the social network that inspires the recognition of humanity. If the function of the cubicle is to create a space where society and privacy were conjoined, Melville shows the consequences of this on those who spend their time, far, far too much of their time, in a place where society is reduced to waiting for commands and privacy becomes equated with isolation. The end result is the perpetuation of cadaverous figures like Bartleby, whose life literally cannot exist for long beyond the workplace. You understand the notion of the eradication of the human and how the workplace engineers that, at least in terms of Melville's portrayal of it? Does that much make sense? Okay. Point 2. The Gothic office space. Melville expands on this problem with the office space in an odd aside concerning a murder that occurred on Wall Street some years back, when Samuel Adams had been killed by his debtor, John Colt, in an attempt to regain money. The murder trial focused less on issues of the facts of the case. Colt admitted to killing Adams with a hatchet before crating the corpse and sending it off to New Orleans. The trial was more focused on the questions of premeditation, self-defense, and accidental violence in the heat of the moment. Melville, who had been away during the early 1840s, was not present during the time of the trial, but deemed the case an important anchor for the story. The narrator writes the following, quote, Often it had occurred to me in my ponderings upon this subject that had the altercation taken place in the public street or at a private residence, it would not have terminated as it did. It was the circumstance of being alone in a solitary office upstairs of a building entirely unhallowed by humanizing domestic associations. An uncarpeted office, doubtless of a dusty, haggard sort of appearance. This is what it must have been, which greatly helped to enhance the irritable desperation of the hapless colt. End quote. The murder localizes the lawyer's thoughts concerning how Wall Street's particularly dehumanizing environment participates in shaping human actions. Violence is not expected on a public street. Not only would bystanders enforce the unwritten social mandate preventing physical altercations, but also streets offer few comfortable places to just stop and talk. They're designed to facilitate movement efficiently, right? I mean, when you're on the street or the sidewalk, people are moving, and it's hard to just stop for longer than a few minutes. Such passages, like a street or a sidewalk, are hostile to those who linger or even move slowly. Alternatively, private residences are more than just a storehouse for possessions. These spaces are personalized, and they allow for a particular choreography that gathers those within its confines into a human world, a world that cherishes and preserves human life. Melville's lawyer grasps that office spaces combine the worst of both worlds. As public spaces, they anonymously house human bodies as though they were objects in an impersonal setting, depriving them of their humanity, while desk work isolates employees and deprives them of the sense of communality that emerges among strangers in the street. Melville's point seems to be that the very environment of the workplace, uncarpeted, dehumanizing, participates in the devaluing of human life, making a murder far more likely to occur. Murder is important here chiefly because it's an exceptionally clear manifestation of the latent use of violence and power that exists throughout Wall Street, and in some ways, therefore, the world. Wall Street's been at the center of various kinds of power since the early conquest of the Americas. It was a scene of slave trading in the 17th century under Dutch rule, and it became a place where traders would meet in the late 18th century. It also served as the site of George Washington's inauguration and the passage of the Bill of Rights. There's a lot of power that's centered in that small area. Today, of course, the power is nakedly financial in nature. And we have this pretense that is divorced from the political machine that operates in DC, but that's a pretty thin veil that keeps those two distinct. That said, I think we still recognize the importance of Wall Street as a symbol of power and as a center of power, and that's the importance of that as the destination for Occupy Wall Street, right? It made sense to occupy Wall Street in some ways because that's where power is centered, even beyond Washington, D.C. That's where real power is centered. It's not a neutral space, as dead and empty and vacant and anonymous and impersonal as it is. Its impersonality is not neutral. It's not objective. It's horrifying. Melville gestures toward the nature of its power by using Bartleby as a connective tissue. The three spaces that Bartleby is known to inhabit are Wall Street in the office, the Tombs, which is the prison where he dies, and the Dead Letter Office. The structure of the prison replicates that of the office without the pretense of a nicety. It's a fact that distresses the narrator. When he visits Bartleby, he believes that he sees the eyes of murderers and thieves peering from the narrow slits of the jail windows, and they're watching him. On the one hand, it's clear that he recognizes his vulnerability to surveillance only when reflecting that others are in a position to oversee him without themselves being seen. But he never reaches the moment of self-awareness that allows him to see the office as something similarly arranged. Only the reader can do that. More importantly, however, the narrator's self-centered approach prevents him from realizing that the prisoners he fears are the ones who are under constant scrutiny and observation as part of a system of surveillance, implicit violence, and dehumanization. That's what a prison system is. Put otherwise, the ostensibly clean and orderly space of Wall Street is as shown as being as rank with horrors as the House in the Black Hat. Even if the language and events aren't quite as grotesque as those that Poe featured, the systems of violence and power are very, very similar. The third space, the Dead Letter Office, is where hopes are burned, at long last. It's a depressing space governed with official neutrality and objectivity. It is not a place of home. What becomes clear when examining the spaces of the story in reverse, if you begin with the hopeless efficiency of the dead letter office, move through the tombs, and then return to Wall Street, is the sense of power's dehumanizing influence on people. After power takes control, after humans become abstracted from particular embodied persons, hope is lost, and we die slow, unknowing deaths. Because Bartleby is a short story, not much information is given about the tombs, and the dead letter office is only given a paragraph of the narrator's conjecture. On the surface, the point of Melville's appropriation of these particular place names seems exhausted in their explicit association of government bureaucracy and death. Appearing at the end of the story, these places retroactively guide readers to understanding the office as a space where death also occurs and lingers, especially given the narrator's memory of the Colt murder. This reading is undermined by the fact that the only two deaths mentioned in the story, Bartleby and Adams, who that's the one that Colt murders, are merely hinted at by the narrator. Adams' death is merely implied in a description of Colt. Quote, "Poor Colt, being dreadfully incensed by Adams and imprudently permitting himself to get wildly excited, was at unawares hurried into his fatal act, an act which certainly no man could possibly deplore more than the actor himself." The actual death of the victim is totally erased. The action is only on the murderer, not on the victim. Does that sound familiar? In the wake of Paris, in the wake of, all sorts of, the Planned Parenthood, that's generally been the trend, and it still exists today. Bartleby's demise is similarly disguised. Quote, "Strangely huddled at the base of the wall, his knees drawn up and lying on his side, his head touching the cold stones, I saw the wasted Bartleby, but nothing stirred. I paused, then went up close to him, stooped over, and saw that his dim eyes were open. Otherwise, he seemed profoundly sleeping. Something prompted me to touch him. I felt his hand when a tingling shiver ran up my arm and down my spine to my feet. The round face of the grub man peered upon me now. His dinner's ready. Won't he dine today either? Or does he live without dining? Lives without dining, said I, and closed his eyes. Hey, he's asleep, ain't he? But the kings and counselors, murmured I. Obscuring both the moment of death and the violence, both explicit and implicit, that caused it, the narrator emphasizes an interest in life, not death. Melville indicates that the type of violence that engineers spaces where privacy and society intermix, the kind that produces observers like the narrator, is not interested in biological termination. It's horrifying to think about death. It's easier to just cover it over by talking about what life is there. People sleep, they do not die. Our world, the world that we live in, is united by frameworks of power that breed a sense of society and privacy. We have more and more anonymous spaces, and more of our homes reflect that kind of anonymity. More and more of our spaces are prefabricated. They're suburban, they're cookie cutter houses, or they're cookie cutter apartments, and they're filled with goods from IKEA or Target, all of which look exactly alike. We can be at home anywhere we move. Because of that, that's the advantage that's sold to us. We just forget about the danger. But just like the offices of Wall Street, which also function interchangeably, remember how the narrator is able to just leave to another office once Bartleby would refuse to quit his. So also have our homes become interchangeable. Fewer and fewer of our possessions have a sense of history and time, especially in a time when continual upgrades and disposable products lead us to spend money rather than preserve. Quietly, and perhaps with resignation, we reflect our environments. And when these environments emphasize the human potential to be regulated and secured as interchangeable entities, the ability to gather individual human possibilities diminishes. In such environments, our own most qualities are expropriated, and we forget the broad range of what we might become. So by exposing the violence and death that anchors this world, Melville discloses how the whole of our lives are spent in a new kind of Gothic space. Unlike the traditional ones steeped in history and haunted by particular ghosts, our new Gothic space is haunted by the living dead, impersonal workers who have become departicularized, their functions rather than people, their means instead of ends. Have you noticed the trend in zombie movies and TV shows and books? Does that make more sense? That's the new Gothic in America today. It's the living dead, and we're all among them all the time. The actual negation of life, murder, becomes a tragic confirmation of a process that's already always ongoing. And this can be seen in our world relative to the Black Lives Matter, or the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I don't want to trivialize the truth of the movement in any way, but to realize that the problem of dehumanization is something that affects everyone, even though it's most acutely and most prominently present in the lives of African and Native Americans. It's still something that haunts us all the time. And it doesn't excuse murder, but Melville seems to indicate that we're more prone to violence by dwelling in these new Gothic spaces than we might have been otherwise. It conditions us, and we become trained to value life less and less and less in its acute, embodied particularity. Does that make sense? All right. Point 3. The inadequacy So for Melville, it's not good enough to sketch out a problem. He has to make the problem worse, because that's kind of how Melville wants to work. So alongside his criticisms of how public spaces are dehumanizing, especially in the developing world of business relations that have become all too familiar to us, Melville also undermines the possibility that Christianity and the Enlightenment ethics of dispassionate compassion can stand against this threat. He shows this in a number of scenes, each of which reveals ways that the narrator is able to praise himself for doing the right thing while simultaneously doing absolutely nothing that attends to Bartleby's humanity. The first hint of this comes when Bartleby's presence interrupts the narrator's church-going. The narrator feels, quote, that things that I had seen disqualified me for the time from church-going, and he walks home instead of church thinking of what I could do with Bartleby. His solution is to, quote, put certain calm questions to him the next morning, touching his history and etc. And if he declined to answer, he would give him a $20 bill over and above what I might owe him and tell him his services were no longer required, but that if in any other way I could assist him, I would be happy to do so. End quote. From the narrator's perspective, it's a charitable resolution to the problem. Help the guy out, give him more than what he earned, and they'd both be set free from each other. The motivation of simply getting rid of Bartleby becomes clear as he continues thinking, quote, if he desired to return to his native place, wherever that might be, I would willingly help to defray the expenses. Moreover, after reaching home, he found himself at any time in want of aid, a letter from him would be sure of a reply. End quote. What the narrator is willing to do is evacuate Bartleby. What he's not willing to do is engage in a personal relationship with Bartleby that strikes at Bartleby as a human being. The only time he's willing to touch Bartleby is when Bartleby has become a dead body. That's the only moment of personal, human, touched contact. That's the only time he feels who Bartleby is. So, after the failure of his initial conversation, which is derailed on the question of preferences, and after time passes, the narrator eventually reaches his limit. And the reader feels a lot of sympathy for this man, right? I mean, how many of you are just enraged at Bartleby and you felt really, really bad for the narrator? He's just trying to be a nice guy and he's being so calm and reasonable and rational. And Bartleby just prefers not to do those things, right? I mean, you feel a lot of sympathy for the narrator. Melville does a great job at that, I think. But the narrator's Melville doesn't make it easy after a while to really believe in the narrator's goodness. The narrator's intention of eliminating Bartleby instead is what keeps coming up. So he says, quote, he had now become a millstone to me, not only useless as a necklace, but afflictive to bear. Yet I was sorry for him. I speak less truth when I say that, on his own account, he occasioned me uneasiness. If he would have but named a single relative or friend, I would have instantly written and urged their taking the poor fellow away to some convenient retreat. But he seemed alone, absolutely alone in the universe, a bit of wreck in the mid-Atlantic. At length, necessities connected with my business tyrannized all other considerations. Of course, right? Business is tyrannical. That's how power works. Decently as I could, I told Bartleby that in 6 days' time, he must unconditionally leave the office. I warned him to take measures in the interval for procuring some other abode. I offered to assist him in this endeavor if he himself would but take the first step towards a removal. And when you finally quit me, Bartleby, added I shall see that you go away not entirely unprovided. 6 days from this hour, remember. End quote. Bartleby, of course, prefers not to quit the place. And it's at this point that, quote, the old Adam of resentment rose up, unquote, but the narrator recalls the commandment to charity, to love. But what's important isn't the command that he remembers, it's the motivation for charity. And the motivation for charity isn't to help another person. It's not to be with them in their humanity. It's to save himself. Here's how the narrator reflects, quote, aside from higher considerations, charity often operates as a vastly wise and prudent principle, a great safeguard to its possessor. No man that I ever heard of ever committed a diabolical murder for sweet charity's sake. Mere self-interest, then, if no better motive can be enlisted, should, especially with high-tempered men, prompt all beings to charity and philanthropy. At any rate, upon the occasion in question, I strove to drown my exasperated feelings toward the scrivener by benevolently construing his conduct. Poor fellow, thought I. He don't mean anything, and besides, he has seen hard times and ought to be indulged. The narrator's recourse to charity pushes him away from a sense of vulnerable love that would posit his equality with Bartleby at the level of humanity. And instead he moves toward a sense of self-interest that reinforces his assumption of power and superiority. He ought to be indulged. The problem with this mode of ethics is that does that as a mode of ethics sound familiar? Really, really familiar? The problem with it is that it becomes successful primarily in allowing those who deploy it to feel better about themselves. Doing things for charity cannot and will not ever resolve systemic problems. It's great to send money to places that are hit by natural disasters or acts of war, but it doesn't fix the problem. It's great to donate a week of time to build shelters for the poor, but it doesn't fix the problem. Spending 90% of our lives working to perpetuate systems that create the problem cannot be undone by sending a check. And that's what Melville points out to us. Charity is not the answer. We just want it to be the answer because we can feel good about it that way. And that's it. Make sense? Point 4. Resistance to power. I suggested in the first week of class that Gothic stories are better at offering criticisms than providing solutions, and I believe that Bartleby is no strong exception to this rule. Melville provides a hint for how to resist power, however, and I think it's a hint that's worth exploring. So, in the end, Bartleby does nothing beyond persist in space. His conversations become an impossible chain of negated conditional preferences. He refuses to state what he wants. He makes no demands. He merely articulates what he would prefer not to do. There's no hint of an if that would render the future conditional would into something more solid. His use of the phrase begins to infect the language and the logic of those around him. He successfully begins to destabilize that really small local locus of power around him. But ultimately, Bartleby's body is transported to the tombs where he dies. The narrator, who's the person who had the most frequent interactions with him, who engaged with him most continuously, never realizes who or what Bartleby was or what he meant. He misses the point entirely by the end of the story. It's a fight for the death for reasons that are obscured, and the only thing that really happens as a result of Bartleby's struggle against power is that he dies. There's nothing heroic about it. Nothing is gained. It's an empty battle. At the same time, the power structures didn't win, and I think that's the thing to take out of the story. Even though Bartleby dies, it's not through succumbing to power. Bartleby never gives up his autonomy. He never gives up his refusal to do more than prefer not to do things. Bartleby's story is one that still provokes the narrator, who writes the story in response to events that have clearly unsettled and continue to haunt him. He seems impervious to the need to change his own behaviors, and he's unable to reflect on the truth of Bartleby's story. But what the narrator bears witness to, Melville seems to indicate, cannot help but be communicated to others. And that seems important. If nothing else, it's not exactly in vain, because something is transacted out from Bartleby's death into the hands of the reader. What that is incredibly hard. I don't know what it means. Nobody can really know what it means. The narrator certainly doesn't. But something emerges out from the story, and that something seems to indicate a truth about what resistance to power looks like and what it means. Are we supposed to live as Bartleby? To some extent, we already do, I think, more than we'd like to admit. Bartleby just takes it to a new level of honesty, right? We still spend our time in impersonal spaces. We still passively become objects that are manipulated from waiting room to waiting room, into this bus seat, to this airplane seat, to this restaurant chair, all of which are totally anonymous, not places for me, but places for one to sit while one waits or while one eats. We go from hotel room to hotel room, apartment to apartment, house to house, and it's all the same. There's spaces for one and not a space for me. We always are living like Bartleby, more than we want to be. But I think that Bartleby's more honest about that. I think he stops resisting the influence that the world has upon him. He succumbs. He embraces his dehumanization and his depersonalization far more than any of us are willing to. We cling to our illusions, much like the narrator does. But that doesn't necessarily work either. It doesn't not work, it doesn't work. It's a difficulty in the heart of the text that I think readers are supposed to grapple with in its incredibly unresolvable, incredibly frustrating way. Melville, I think, is still realistic about the end result of such a life. It's just as meaningless as one where you spend your time working, right? I mean, Bartleby's death isn't a meaningful death. His life isn't a meaningful life. And I think that's part of what Melville's point is. There's no way, when we live in a world constrained by abstracted power relations, and we inhabit spaces dictated by the logic of power, there's no way for us to do anything meaningful. Our lives are not meaningful. Our deaths are not meaningful. We've always already lost as soon as we're born into such a world. I don't think that Melville suggests that Bartleby has the answer, and the narrator doesn't seem to have the answer to it either. The narrator's self-congratulatory desire for charity seems rather repugnant. Bartleby's obstinacy is equally repugnant, right? I mean, nobody wants to be Bartleby because it's empty, but the narrator is just as empty. And even though Bartleby's actions freed him from the world of power of control, it's not a really livable solution. And that's the story. Implications. Number one, it behooves us, I think, to be aware of how spaces affect us in our daily lives. They do. We too often reflect and behave in ways that passively reflect the environments around us, and we spend too little time really personalizing our worlds with who we are. We float through life without being willing to leave a trace of who we are on it. We want to be mobile and flexible and easily transported. We want to carry ourselves with us. But in doing so, we remove the possibility of humanizing and inhabiting the world the way that Sleepy Hollow was in habitation, right? It had time and history and people dwelt there. We don't dwell in that way anymore. Maybe more dwelling. Maybe being willing to take root in a place and transform it. Maybe in a small way initially, but having that grow, maybe that would help to fight through the abstractions of power. At the same time, with eminent domain and pipelines running through, no matter what, and new interstates going through and new buildings being erected, it's hard because we don't have the power to really enforce our desire to have roots. Number two, it's easy to get caught up in logics of doing the right thing instead of reflecting on how easily the right thing becomes integrated with wrong situations. Even if we cannot directly attack power structures because they're too amorphous and too deeply ingrained in a human greed for certainty and control, we can nevertheless speak out and identify them. We can do so indirectly, as I think Melville's doing in this story. We can do so directly. And I think a direct response to abuses of power becoming more and more accepted in our world. What does it mean? What does it mean that Black Lives Matter? I don't know what it means. I don't know that it will change anything about our world. I kind of doubt that it will, and it makes me sad. I wish it would. But at the very least, we can testify to it, and we can embrace it, and we can publicize it, and we can name it. And we can name it in the hopes that someday somebody will figure out a way to change it in a way that makes it better. Not just kind of better, not just more accepted or more tolerated or more invisible, but actually better at a human level. 3, it's difficult to behave with integrity in our world. There's no easy way to make restitution for slavery or for the genocide of Native Americans. nor is there an easy way to atone for the innocents slaughtered while we wage wars around the globe. But while we continue to search for answers, we can at least acknowledge our guilt, our complicity, and the terrors that we persist in perpetuating, even if we would prefer not to. We're born guilty into this world. And it's not fun to feel guilt. It's not fun to be ashamed. But the more that we're honest about it, I think the better off the world can be. And finally, and I think maybe most importantly, what this story indicates is the importance of humanity. And the need for a humanity that really centers on human touch, on human contact, on not escaping behind screens, whether they're moral screens or ethical screens or religious screens, but to come out from behind the screens and really look at people and really engage with who they are at a level that doesn't treat them as, something that needs to be pampered or something that needs to be taken care of. I think it requires that we acknowledge our own deep vulnerability in the world, our own need for every other person that we encounter to be that person, and to expose ourselves to that person, and to invite that person to expose themselves to us in a really raw, personal way. Because without that, we're all just the narrator. And we're all running in circles, and we're all wondering what happened to our world and what happened to the humans within it. Does that make sense? Questions?
I don't have a question, but when I read this, I couldn't help but think, and I'm even thinking more as you talk, about the homeless situation. I walk by them every day, and I guess the dehumanization part bothers me because I personally have to dehumanize them. I can't, if I humanize them, I couldn't walk by and leave that man laying there in sub-zero temperatures all night in the rain. I couldn't do that. I did stop and got a sandwich for one guy and his dog the other night, but it's my own defense mechanism. How do I deal with that if I don't humanize them? If they're an individual, I can't let that happen.
And that's how it perpetuates. I mean, the answer that Jesus gave is probably the best one. Sell all of your possessions and give the money to the poor. Stop living in houses. Become homeless. Is it practicable? Do I do that? No, absolutely not. Do I regret that I lack the integrity to do that? Yeah, I do. Does it change anything that I feel one way about it as opposed to another? Not at all. Not at all. But the plight of homelessness, I mean, on the one hand, like we talked about in the sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon, we're all homeless, right? We all lack roots. And a way of being at home in the world is the one I think that Irving does the best job of explaining, where we really enmesh ourselves in a local situation and become at home there. Whether we're in a chair in front of a fireplace or in a hotel room or whatever, there's a way that we can make ourselves at home there in a way that's open and that receives the nature of that place. The danger of that when we live in this world is that by opening ourselves to those kinds of spaces, we become more and more abstracted, more and more depersonalized ourselves, which in turn makes it far easier for us to depersonalize others. So the homeless people become just the benches that they sleep on, and nothing more. They might as well be statues.
Yeah, of course, talk about a guilt trip. I had to go to Starbucks, of course, and get my $4 cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. And one guy was saying to the other guy, "We don't need them. We will take care of ourselves."
It's a problem. I think part of the problem is that it's not something that individuals can fix. It's a community problem. But we don't have community anymore in the same kind of way, right? Rather than a community is a group of humans that know each other and care for each other. Instead of community, we have society that's abstracted. We trust social structures to take care of it. We pay our taxes, say that we've done our part, but we don't have community with anybody outside of our social circles. That's something that's by and large and increasingly just a way of the past. And what we've gotten instead, like this abstract notion of citizenship, abstract membership into a township, or like those kinds of social things, it's an impoverished notion of community. True community requires an embrace of humanity instead of an abstraction away from it. But how do you create community in this? Like Iowa City's not even that big of a town, but it's still hard to create community here. It's still too big for that. And that's what society does really well. I mean, society works really, really well. It functions. It gives us roads and we can go back and forth and commute and whatnot. But it doesn't give us community. And without community, individuals become depersonalized and die alone. And so the question becomes, rather than how can I do this thing at this time or this thing at that time, it's how can I create a better sense of community in this world? Because as a community, and that's part of what I think Occupy Wall Street did right? It created a different kind of community, one that tried to erase all sorts of other kinds of divides to show what people had in common at a really human level. It was a new kind of community, or as an attempt to use digital culture to create a better, more disparate sense of community so that people didn't feel alone anymore. People didn't feel as trapped or as isolated, but it went away. It couldn't resist, not for very long. It went the way of Bartleby. Does that answer your question? Again, the Gothic's really, really good at pointing out the problems. It's not really good at pointing out answers, because there in some ways there are no answers. And the fact that this was written, 150 years ago doesn't help. We haven't made progress in any way. We've made things worse, far worse from a human perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the death of him, again, and I'm sorry about keep going back to the homeless, but I can see the guys huddled up and curled up and dying there. So his death was very timely. You're right, it's going on today.
All over. But what we can do, at the very least, is put spikes on benches and like concrete platforms and things to prevent the homeless from sleeping there. Because if we don't see it, then they don't exist, right? I mean, that's the charitable thing to do. I mean, honestly.
I mean, if they shouldn't want to be seen. They should want to exit to the countryside,
right?
Live like the animals,
right. Because they're not part of the society. They're certainly not part of the community. They're marginal. And the number of marginalized people who have mental disabilities of all sorts, whether they're addiction issues or other kinds of mental disabilities, who lack family, who lack any sense of community, I mean, that's their problem and their fault. If you don't have a home, you don't belong to society. You don't have community. And they have their own community, they do look out for each other. And that may also be something to consider, what the price of community actually is.
Daniel, do you see any parallels at all of the difficulty of living life with integrity of being born into guilt with the Christian thesis of original sin?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, Heidegger riffs on this and being in time a little bit in terms of the notion of fallenness, and he's clear to say here's why it's not exactly Christian. But I think there's a sense when Heidegger talks about our thrownness into the world, we inherit a situation that isn't ours, right? When wars are committed or when wars are waged by the people of the United States, when people are killed on death row in the name of the people of the United States, that's on me. Is it my guilt personally? No. But I live in society, I enjoy social benefits. One of the social benefits is the ability to go to war, to make machines and weapons of mass destruction, to kill people who are deemed unfit for society. I mean, that's something I do passively, but I still participate in it. Is it my guilt exactly? No, but it's something that comes along with being born into the world. I think the Christian sense of fallibility or fallenness is different, right? So what theologians would say with original sin is that we're born cursed. We're doomed to sin. We're doomed to fail. The kind of social guilt that Heidegger gestures toward, and I think that Melville really indicates a lot more clearly, is a guilt that has just as little easy resolution. In fact, there's no resolution, right? From a Christian standpoint, you just accept forgiveness for your sins, original sin gone, right? I mean, you're still originally sinful, you're no Christ, you're not going to be perfect according to some, whatever. This situation is far trickier because there's no Messiah. I mean, Bernie Sanders might be great, but he's not going to really give us community again in the same way. He's not going to personalize us. Obama certainly didn't. Anonymous violence increased under Obama through the use of drones. There's no answer. There's no Messiah. There's no way out. Nothing will help us. And we can avoid thinking about it because it's incredibly just taxing to think about all the time. It's far better to watch, the new Superbook hero movie, or, just watch things on Netflix or whatever, than think about what our world actually is and how often we participate in it and numb ourselves from actually confronting it. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I mean, we're innocent in a way because it's not our fault. I don't have exact culpability. And there's really no, I could leave the US, but where can I go? There's nowhere in the world that doesn't have these matrices of power and these axes of power just flowing through it. Because it does. There are hierarchies all over it. Economic, financial, gubernatorial, like actual violence, like it's all over. There's no place to escape. We're in a human world, and that human world is a really fairly awful place. But I do have the option in my own life of engaging in community whenever I can, of really looking at people as if they were humans, of being vulnerable to that, of sharing that with them. Does that change the world? No, but it at least gives a start at something. And that's about as much as I can do. Not to absolve my guilt, because I'm always guilty, but to at least be actively working against perpetuating it. Other questions? Zach?
So when I was reading the story, one thing I was grappling with was whether Bartleby refused to engage with the main character because he could detect his lack of altruistic intentions, or whether it was because his lack of humanity made it impossible for him to actually engage with someone in an authentic way. And it's possible that there's a third option that I'm not considering, but I'm just trying to get a sense of the character of Bartleby.
Well, it's hard to grasp the character of Bartleby because Bartleby has no. He's characterless. He has no. There's very little. He's not. He says it himself. I'm not very particular. There's no particularity to him. We don't get anything about him except for a continual desire to prefer not to. And it's not even a desire to prefer not to. It's just I would prefer not to. That's all we really get. That's all there is to Bartleby. Why he's that way? We could be like the narrator and theorize, like, oh, it's because he did this or did that. But in most ways, I think Bartleby is in Melville's The Confidence Man. He talks about the difficulty of making. I think he called it a unique character, something that couldn't exist but comes into being only in a fictional way. That's an impossible human possibility in some ways. And Melville's great at that. The Confidence Man in that book is great. Bartleby's a great example. What was his last story? I can't remember the guy who punches the other guy. Anyway, I can't remember the title of it. But his fiction is decorated with absolutely unique characters who aren't human, who aren't humanly livable in that way, but sketch out extreme genius human possibilities that we can consider and think about in our own lives.
So you can't understand them, but it's possible to ignore their actual existence.
Yeah.
Or maybe not impossible, but
They're paradoxes, and they force you, once you confront them, to contend with them, the way any good paradox would. That's kind of a slant at your question. Does that make sense, though?
yeah, that's probably the best answer I could have gotten.
Okay. Anything else?
Are you going to do an uplifting class?
What do you guys think? Do you think
I thought Beyond Belief was actually.
Yeah, that's
fairly
true. That's
uplifting.
true. Once I get back to Beyond Belief, we'll get to something. Masters of Suspicion, though, like I said, it's just it's a pretty unrelenting slog through what's wrong with the world.
But it's been good discussions.
Good. So it was interesting today.
It's very
Good.
interesting.
Helpful.